Before we begin, viewer discretion is strongly advised. The following is for educational and entertainment purposes only. What happens when a jury in a high-profile trial faces a twist they weren't expecting? What if one juror simply can't follow the rules? Could the outcome of this case really change because of one person's actions? Stick with us as we uncover the latest shocking development in the Diddy trial. The tension surrounding Sean Diddy Combs' federal sex trafficking and racketeering trial has been building for weeks. This has been one of the most publicized trials in recent memory, drawing attention from both fans and critics alike. The courtroom has seen bombshell testimonies, emotional cross-examinations, and shocking revelations, each one shaking the foundations of what many thought they knew about the music mogul. After weeks of intense legal battles, the case has now entered its final phase, jury deliberation. It all started when several women came forward with accusations against Diddy, alleging years of abuse, exploitation, and manipulation. Their stories painted a picture of a powerful man who allegedly used his influence and wealth to control and manipulate young women for his own gain. These allegations cover a span of over a decade, touching on both personal and professional levels. The government has accused Diddy of running an extensive network that trafficked women and used them for sex under duress, coercion, and threats. The charges paint a chilling portrait of a man who, according to the prosecution, used his status and wealth. But of course, there's another side to the story. Diddy's legal team has fiercely denied all accusations, claiming that these women's stories are fabricated or exaggerated. According to them, these allegations are nothing more than an attempt to tarnish his reputation. Diddy's presumed innocence has been the cornerstone of his defense. Under the American legal system, he's been given the benefit of the doubt, which means the prosecution has the burden of proof. Diddy's attorneys have spent weeks tearing apart the testimonies of the accusers, casting doubt on their credibility, and attempting to discredit the evidence presented by the government. In fact, this trial has felt more like a battle over perception than a mere fight for justice. The defense has tried to portray Diddy as a victim of a smear campaign, a powerful man targeted by those looking to capitalize on his fame and fortune. But the prosecution has gone to great lengths to paint a very different picture. They've introduced numerous witnesses who've detailed the alleged abuse, with some claiming they were promised career opportunities in exchange for sexual favors. The high-stakes cross-examinations have been nothing short of a spectacle, as Diddy's lawyers attempt to tear down the credibility of each witness, while the prosecution counters by accusing the defense of attacking the victims instead of addressing the real issue. Each day in the courtroom has been filled with tension, as the testimonies and evidence seem to build up a damning case. And then, just when it seemed like the end was near, a curveball was thrown into the mix. We now find ourselves at the critical point where the jury, after weeks of absorbing this complex and emotionally charged testimony, must make a decision. As they sit in the jury room, the fate of Sean Diddy Combs rests in their hands. Will they find him guilty of these serious charges, or will they determine that the prosecution has failed to meet the standard of proof? In any case, the deliberations are bound to be just as dramatic as the trial itself. Before the jury began their deliberations, Judge Subramanian made sure to give them clear instructions. He reminded them that Sean Diddy Combs is presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, a key aspect of the justice system. But he also explained that reasonable doubt is not an all-encompassing doubt. It's a doubt that would make a reasonable person hesitate, but not necessarily an absolute uncertainty. The judge emphasized that the jury must look at the facts and decide whether the prosecution's case is strong enough to convict. If they believe the evidence isn't enough, they must acquit. But it wasn't just the presumption of innocence that stood in the spotlight. The nature of the evidence presented during the trial has been a significant point of contention. There's been a lot of focus on the types of evidence the jury can consider: direct versus circumstantial. Direct evidence is straightforward, things like eyewitness testimony or physical exhibits that directly prove a point. Circumstantial evidence, on the other hand, requires the jury to make inferences based on the facts. For example, if a person walks into a room drenched in rain, it's reasonable to infer that it's raining outside, even if the jury didn't witness the rain firsthand. This type of evidence has been at the core of the case, with the prosecution trying to build a case based on inferences inferences drawn from the testimonies of witnesses and the chain of events. As the trial entered its final days, the jury was also reminded about how to evaluate witness credibility. This was crucial, as many of the key testimonies were from women who had varying degrees of involvement in Diddy's life. The judge explained that the jury could weigh the witnesses' demeanor, consistency, and any red flags in their testimony. If they believed a witness lied about just one thing, they had the right to disregard part or all of that person's testimony. The defense eagerly seized on these points, trying to sow doubt about the reliability of the accusers. The prosecution, on the other hand, stressed that the consistency and detail in the stories painted a troubling picture. By the time the jury entered deliberations, they had already heard the most dramatic parts of the case. But as we'll soon see, the real drama was only just beginning. With so much on the line, the stakes have never been higher. The jury is now tasked with deciding whether Diddy is guilty of running a criminal operation that trafficked women, or if the allegations were simply a result of false accusations and misunderstandings. As they deliberate, the eyes of the public and the world are fixed on the outcome of this trial. Will the jury come to a conclusion that resonates with the public's perception of the music mogul? Or will they find that the prosecution couldn't prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt? With the case now in their hands, the jury's verdict could change everything for Sean Diddy Combs. As the trial of Sean Diddy Combs enters its final phase, the attention now shifts to the jury, who are tasked with determining the fate of the music mogul. In a case as high-profile and emotionally charged as this one, the jury's role cannot be overstated. Their decision will not only impact Diddy's future, but could also send shockwaves throughout the entertainment industry. But before they could deliberate on the case, the judge, Aaron Subramanian, made sure to give the jury very specific instructions on what to consider and how to approach their decision-making process. First and foremost, Judge Subramanian reminded the jury of the core principle of the American legal system, the presumption of innocence. He emphasized that Diddy, like any defendant, is presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. This is a fundamental concept in the justice system, one that ensures fairness for the accused. It means that the prosecution bears the burden of proof and must convince the jury that Diddy committed the crimes he's accused of, not beyond all doubt, but beyond a reasonable doubt. The judge explained that the term reasonable doubt isn't as complicated as some might think. It's not a matter of needing absolute certainty, but rather whether the evidence presented in the trial has convinced a reasonable person to hesitate in their decision. If there's a doubt in the jury's mind that would cause them to question Diddy's guilt, they must acquit. This instruction, while simple, holds immense power. It underscores the fact that a conviction cannot be based on speculation, bias, or personal feelings. The jury's decision must solely rest on the evidence presented during the trial. It's a safeguard against wrongful convictions and ensures that the defendant's rights are upheld. In a case with such high stakes, like this one, where emotions and public opinion can easily cloud judgment, these instructions play a critical role in guiding the jury to a fair and unbiased decision. Judge Subramanian went on to break down the types of evidence the jury was allowed to consider. This was a key part of his instructions, as the evidence presented during the trial had been a mix of direct and circumstantial, each carrying its own weight and importance. Direct evidence is the more straightforward type of evidence, things like eyewitness testimony, physical exhibits, or documents that can directly prove a point. For instance, if a witness testifies that they saw Diddy engage in the alleged criminal acts, that's direct evidence. The jury can consider it at face value as a piece of factual information presented during the trial. Direct evidence has a certain immediacy to it, and it often seems more compelling because it's more difficult to challenge or dispute. However, the majority of the evidence in this trial was circumstantial. Circumstantial evidence doesn't directly prove that a crime was committed, but suggests it through inferences and logical deductions. This type of evidence is often misunderstood or underestimated by the public, who may wrongly assume that circumstantial cases are weak. But Judge Subramanian was clear in his explanation. Circumstantial evidence can be incredibly strong and persuasive. The jury was told to treat circumstantial evidence as seriously as direct evidence. For example, the judge explained that if someone enters a room with a wet umbrella, it's reasonable to infer that it's raining outside, even if the jury didn't witness the rain themselves. It's not a direct observation of the rain, but the umbrella provides enough context for the jury to make a logical conclusion. In the Diddy case, many of the testimonies and the evidence were circumstantial, requiring the jury to connect the dots and use their common sense to evaluate the case. It wasn't just about what was said on the witness stand, it was about piecing together the facts in a way that made sense. As the jury listened to the evidence, they were also reminded of how to assess the credibility of witnesses. This is where the judge's instructions really gave the jurors the power to influence the outcome of the trial. Judge Subramanian made it clear that the jury, not the judge, was the final authority on whether a witness was truthful or reliable. They were told to consider factors like the witness's demeanor, consistency, and whether there were any red flags in their testimony. If a juror believed that a witness lied about even one thing, they had the right to disregard that witness's entire testimony. This is an important instruction because it gives the jury the ability to weigh the credibility of each piece of evidence based on their assessment. But it wasn't just about the witness's honesty, it was also about the potential motivations behind their testimony. The jury was instructed to consider whether a witness stood to gain something from the trial's outcome, whether that was financial compensation, a deal with the prosecution, or some other benefit. This is especially crucial in a case like this one, where many of the witnesses had been involved with Diddy in some capacity. Were they telling the truth, or were they testifying to benefit from the trial's results? These are the kinds of questions the jury had to ask themselves as they deliberated. The judge also reminded the jury that they couldn't speculate about things that weren't part of the trial. If a witness didn't testify or if certain evidence was left out, it was not their job to infer why that happened. They had to focus only on what was presented in the courtroom and avoid making assumptions based on what they didn't know. With these instructions in mind, the jury finally began their deliberations. These guidelines were essential because they ensured that the jury remained focused on the law and the evidence, without being swayed by external factors or personal biases. The jury's job was clear: to assess the evidence, apply the law, and come to a verdict that was just and fair. As they began deliberating, each juror had to carefully consider whether the prosecution had truly proven Diddy's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, or if the defense had created enough doubt to justify an acquittal. This is the moment where the trial's fate would be decided. The jury was tasked with making one of the most important decisions of their lives, and the instructions they received from Judge Subramanian would guide them as they navigated the complexities of the case. Just when it seemed like the trial of Sean Diddy Combs was heading toward its conclusion, a dramatic twist emerged that threatened to unravel everything. The morning of the jury deliberations started like any other, with the jurors settling into the serious business of determining Diddy's fate. But within just a few hours, a bombshell dropped that cast a shadow over the proceedings. Juror 25, one of the 12 jurors, was causing major concern among the rest of the panel. According to the other jurors, this individual was either unable or unwilling to follow the instructions laid out by Judge Subramanian. It started innocently enough, a seemingly minor note sent to the judge, but the contents of that note raised alarm bells in the courtroom. "We have a juror who we believe cannot follow your instructions," the note read. That was it. No further explanation, no details on why or how Juror 25 was failing to comply, just a cryptic message that left more questions than answers. So what exactly was happening? Was this a simple misunderstanding, or was there something far more troubling going on behind the scenes? The jury had spent weeks absorbing testimonies, cross-examinations, and evidence. Surely, by now, they had developed their views about the case. But what could make one juror stand out so starkly from the rest? Was it a simple mistake, a lack of understanding, or was there something deeper, more sinister at play? Immediately, rumors began circulating through the courthouse. Some speculated that Juror 25 might have had a personal bias. Maybe they didn't believe the accusations against Diddy and were trying to influence the rest of the jury. Others wondered if the juror simply couldn't process the weight of the case and the severity of the charges. In a trial where the stakes were as high as this, with accusations of sex trafficking and racketeering hanging over the defendant, could it be that one person's inability to follow instructions could throw the entire case into jeopardy? This uncertainty was enough to set the other jurors on edge. The deliberations had barely begun, and already a potential flaw in the jury's composition was beginning to show. It's not just the integrity of the trial that was at risk here, it was the fairness of the verdict itself. If even one juror wasn't fully engaged in the process, it could cast doubt on the entire deliberation process. The other jurors could feel the pressure mounting, knowing that any small crack in the jury's unity could open the door to mistrial accusations or, worse, a tainted verdict. The integrity of the trial was now in question. The idea that one individual could derail what had been a meticulously constructed case felt like a massive injustice in itself. This wasn't just any trial. This was a high-profile case with the potential to change the lives of those involved forever. The public eye was firmly trained on the proceedings, and now the very deliberation process, the last step before a verdict, was at risk of falling apart due to one person's apparent failure to follow the judge's instructions. Was it possible that Juror 25 had an agenda? Some believed it was a deliberate move to sway the jury's decision, a tactic to introduce doubt where there was none. Others suggested that perhaps this juror had personal reservations about the entire case, doubts about the credibility of the witnesses or the strength of the evidence. Whatever the reason, the drama was unfolding in real time, with the clock ticking down on Diddy's fate. As the day progressed, the tension among the jurors became palpable. If one juror was causing this much disruption, how were the rest of them supposed to reach a fair, unanimous decision? The judge had been clear in his instructions. Each juror must consider the evidence and deliberate without outside influence. The ability to make a decision based solely on the facts presented was paramount. But if Juror 25 was struggling to follow the judge's orders, how could the rest of the jury move forward in good faith? The consequences were severe. The other jurors began to worry that if Juror 25's behavior went unchecked, the deliberations could become hopelessly divided. Could it be that this one individual was making it impossible for the jury to reach a unanimous verdict? In a trial like this, where the accusations were serious and the public attention was overwhelming, even the slightest sign of disunity in the jury could raise eyebrows and spark controversy. What if this juror was holding up the entire process? Was there any way to prevent it from compromising the final decision? And then, just as the clock ticked toward the end of the day, another curveball hit. The jury sent out another note, not just about Juror 25, but about a question that had surfaced during their deliberations. The jurors were now asking whether the act of handing over controlled substances counted as distribution. This was a pivotal question, one that could have major implications for Diddy's charges. The jury wanted clarity on whether involvement in the process, even without physically handing over drugs, could lead to a conviction. This question alone added more complexity to an already complicated case. What did all of this mean? Was it just a miscommunication, or was the integrity of the entire trial on the brink of being compromised? Could Juror 25's behavior be an isolated issue, or was it the symptom of a larger problem within the jury's deliberations? These questions hung in the air as the trial continued its dramatic journey to a conclusion. As the jury struggled to find common ground, the world waited with bated breath, unsure of what would happen next. As the drama of the day unfolded, the question that hung over the courtroom was simple. What happens next? With Juror 25's troubling behavior casting doubt on the integrity of the deliberations, the future of the trial now rested on a razor's edge. Could the deliberations continue as planned, or would this issue force a delay, perhaps even a complete disruption of the entire trial process? The clock was ticking, and with every passing minute, the stakes grew higher. The jury's ability to deliberate fairly and without bias was paramount, but how could they do that with one of their own allegedly failing to follow the judge's instructions? Could the actions of a single juror throw everything into chaos? As the tension built, some wondered whether the trial could be postponed to resolve the issue, throwing Diddy's fate into further uncertainty. Would the jury be forced to start over with a new member, or was the trial too far gone to salvage? But the question on everyone's mind wasn't just about the trial's timing. It was about the potential consequences of a single juror's actions. Could this lead to a mistrial? What impact would this have on the final verdict? If Juror 25's behavior continued, how could the rest of the jury possibly come to a fair and unbiased conclusion? In a case as high-profile and emotionally charged as this, any disruption, no matter how small, could send ripples through the entire process. And then, just as the jury prepared to tackle the day's deliberations, another shockwave hit. The jury sent another note, but this time it wasn't about Juror 25. The note contained a question about the distribution of controlled substances, one that could have a huge impact on the charges Diddy was facing. Could this new question be the key to unlocking a more favorable outcome for the defense, or would it only add another layer of complexity to the case? This new development raised even more questions. Would the judge's answer influence the jury's final decision, or could this be the twist that ultimately sways the outcome? With the case teetering on the brink of uncertainty, the outcome seemed anything but certain. Would the trial be delayed, or would it continue, now shaped by this controversy? What impact would the behavior of one juror have on the trial's conclusion? As we wait for the next step, the question remains, will Diddy's fate be decided by the jury, or will this unexpected twist change everything? Just when it seemed like the jury's deliberations were on track, another curveball was thrown into the mix, adding even more complexity to an already tense trial. The jury sent out a note with a question that caught everyone by surprise. If somebody asks for controlled substances and another person hands it over, does that count as distribution? This was no ordinary question. The issue at hand was crucial to the case and could have a significant impact on the charges Diddy faced. The question centered on whether or not mere involvement in the exchange of controlled substances, without actually handling the drugs, was enough to warrant a distribution charge. Diddy was facing accusations related to sex trafficking, racketeering, and transporting individuals for prostitution. The jury's inquiry about controlled substances added a new layer of potential guilt, as one of the charges related to distributing and transporting drugs in connection with these illegal activities. Why was this question so significant? The outcome of this query could influence the jury's interpretation of the law and ultimately affect the verdict. If the jury believed that the distribution charge could apply to anyone involved in the transaction, it could make Diddy's defense far more challenging. On the other hand, if the judge's response clarified that involvement alone didn't constitute distribution, it could help the defense argue that the prosecution hadn't proven its case as strongly as they thought. The stakes couldn't be higher. The question had the potential to shape the jury's understanding of the charges, and depending on how it was answered, it could tip the scale in favor of the prosecution or the defense. This wasn't just a procedural question. It was a turning point that could either solidify the case against Diddy or provide the defense with a lifeline. The judge, Aaron Subramanian, did not immediately respond to the jury's question. As is standard in these situations, he needed to confer with both the prosecution and defense attorneys to craft an appropriate response. The legal teams would meet to discuss how to address the question, ensuring that the answer adhered to the law while remaining fair to both parties. This process could take hours, and it was unclear whether the judge's eventual answer would resolve the matter or introduce further confusion. This added complexity to an already intense situation. Could this question change the course of the trial? It all depended on how the judge and lawyers navigated this unexpected development. For Diddy, the answer to this query could either bolster his defense or add to the weight of the charges against him, making it even more difficult to avoid conviction. As the clock ticked closer to the end of the day, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The jury had spent hours deliberating, trying to reach a consensus on one of the most high-profile trials in recent memory. But as the final moments of the day approached, it became clear that they were far from a verdict. With the question about controlled substances still hanging in the air and the concerns about Juror 25's behavior unresolved, the jury had reached an impasse. Judge Subramanian addressed the court, informing everyone that the deliberations would be paused for the night. The jury would reconvene the next morning to continue their discussions. This announcement only added to the mounting tension. The unresolved issues, particularly the question of drug distribution, loomed large over the trial. Would the judge's response to the jury's query clarify the situation, or would it create even more uncertainty? The question of Juror 25's ability to follow the judge's instructions also remained unresolved. Would this lead to further complications, or would the jury be able to carry on without disruption? As the courtroom emptied for the night, the weight of these unanswered questions hung in the air. The fate of Sean Diddy Combs now rested on the decisions of the jury, but with so much still up in the air, no one could predict what would happen next. With the trial on hold until the next day, all eyes were now on the next phase of deliberations. Would the jury reach a decision, or would the trial be delayed further? The tension was building, and the anticipation for the next phase of this high-stakes trial was palpable. Is this the moment where Diddy's fate could change because of one person's actions in the jury room? Could a single juror's behavior throw everything into chaos, or will the jury manage to reach a fair verdict despite the drama? With so much still unresolved, the next phase of this trial promises to be just as intense and unpredictable as everything that's come before. Stay tuned for what could be the final shocking twist in the Diddy trial. You don't want to miss the next step in this gripping trial. Hit that subscribe button now to stay updated on every development as it unfolds. We'll be here every step of the way with all the latest details you need to know.